The bell above the workshop door had a crack in it, so instead of a clean ring it made a sound like a held breath being let go. Elias Marrow heard it without looking up. He was elbow-deep in the guts of a 40-year-old tiller, chasing a stripped bolt with a pair of vice grips and a stream of quiet, patient cursing. "Be right with you," he called, not turning. Nobody answered. That was unusual. Most of his customers announced themselves the second they crossed the threshold, eager to complain about a stalled combine or a cranky water pump. The silence made him look up. She was standing just inside the door, one hand still resting on the frame as though she hadn't fully committed to entering. Soft amber fur caught the afternoon light slanting through the dusty window, and her ears, tall, expressive, currently tilted back in a way that made her look like she was bracing for something, twitched at the clang of a wrench Elias set down too quickly. Her tail, long and full and the color of late autumn, curled nervously around one leg. She wore a green cardigan over a plain dress, the kind of outfit that said schoolteacher before she ever opened her mouth. He knew who she was, of course. Everyone in a town of 1,100 people knew Lyra Ashwood, even a mechanic who kept mostly to himself and his machines. She taught the 3rd grade at the village school, the one with the crooked flagpole and the mural of a sunrise that had been fading for a decade. His neighbors' kids adored her. His neighbors' kids adored her so much that Elias had heard her name in his own kitchen more often than he'd heard his own. "Ms. Ashwood," he said, wiping his hands on a rag that did more to redistribute the grease than remove it. "Something wrong with your car?" "No. My car's fine." Her voice was soft, warm even through the nerves fraying its edges. "I'm sorry. I know this is strange. I should have called first, but I didn't know how to say this over the phone, and I thought if I didn't just walk in and say it, I'd never say it at all." Elias set the rag down slowly. In his experience, sentences that began this way usually ended with someone asking him to fix something for free. He liked Lyra Ashwood well enough from a distance, everyone did. But he braced himself anyway. "Okay," he said. "I'm listening." She took a breath that made her shoulders rise and fall, the kind of breath a person takes before jumping into cold water. "Will you pretend to be my husband? Just for one day." The words hung in the grease-smelling air between them. Somewhere in the back of the shop, a radio Elias always forgot to turn off murmured out half a country song. He blinked at her. "I'm sorry, what?" Lyra's cheeks flushed a shade darker beneath her fur, visible even through the amber. "The Family Heritage Festival. It's in 11 days. Every teacher is expected to attend with their spouse. It's tradition, going back generations, something about honoring the families who built the school. I've avoided it for 6 years. I've said I was sick, I've said I had a sick relative, once I said I had to catch a train, which made no sense because we don't even have a train station." She was talking fast now, the words tumbling over each other like she'd been holding them in for a long time and the dam had finally given. "But this year Principal Kessler told me, kindly, but firmly, that if I don't attend with a spouse, the school board is going to start asking why the beloved Ms. Ashwood has been dodging the one event where parents actually get to know her outside the classroom. And the truth is I don't have a husband. I don't have anyone. And I am far, far too proud and far too embarrassed to walk into that gymnasium alone in front of every single parent and child in this village and confirm what half of them already whisper about me at the market." She stopped, out of breath, and looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between hope and horror at her own audacity. Elias didn't say anything for a moment. He was trying to catch up. "You want me," he said slowly, "to pretend to be your husband. At a school festival. In front of children. For one day," she said quickly. "That's all. You wouldn't have to do anything but stand next to me, shake a few hands, maybe eat some unfortunate casserole. I know it's absurd. I know I have no right to ask a near stranger for something like this. But you're..." She hesitated. "I'm what?" "You're kind," she said simply. The Henderson's boy broke his bicycle chain last spring and you fixed it for free and told him it was a warranty issue so he wouldn't feel like he owed you anything. Old Mrs. Purbeck says you shovel her walk every winter and won't take so much as a thank you casserole for it. And her ears dipped again, and her tail, still wrapped around her leg, tightened its coil. You're alone too. I've seen you at the market on Saturdays, always by yourself. I thought maybe you'd understand why I don't want to walk in there alone either. Elias felt something in his chest shift, uncomfortable and unfamiliar, like a bolt finally giving after being stuck for years. He hadn't expected to be seen today. He'd expected a tiller and a stripped bolt and a quiet evening alone with a beer and a baseball game on the radio. I don't have anything to give you in return, he said, which was not quite a no. I mean, I don't need money for this, obviously. But I don't know why you'd want to owe me for something like that. I wasn't going to let you do it for nothing. Lyra's voice steadied, the businesslike tone of a teacher taking attendance. There's an orchard behind your farmhouse. I've seen it from the road. It looks like it hasn't been touched in years. Wild apple and pear trees, all overgrown. That was my grandfather's, Elias said, surprised she knew it was there at all. He passed when I was 22. I never had the time or the know-how to bring it back. I do, Lyra said, and for the first time since she'd walked in, something like genuine light came into her golden eyes. I grew up on an orchard 3 villages over. My mother taught me to prune, to graft, to read a tree's bark like a book. I've dreamed about doing it again since I moved here. I just never had land of my own, or a reason to ask a stranger if I could dig around in his backyard. A small, embarrassed laugh. If you say yes, I'll spend every weekend for as long as it takes bringing that orchard back to life. In exchange for one very silly, very awkward afternoon of pretending to be married to me. Elias looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the orchard, gone wild and tangled behind the farmhouse his grandfather had built with his own 2 hands, the one Elias walked past every morning on his way to the workshop and every evening on his way back, always meaning to do something about it, and never finding the time. He thought about 11 years of Saturdays spent alone at the market, nodding politely to people who pitied him without saying so. One day, he said. Lyra's whole body seemed to loosen with relief, her tail unwinding from around her leg. One day, she agreed. I promise. I'll never ask you for anything like this again. He wiped his hand on the rag one more time, mostly for something to do, and held it out. Elias Marrow. Your husband, apparently. For a day. She took his hand. Her fingers were warm, a little rough at the tips, a teacher's hands, chalk-dusted and gentle but not unused to work. Lyra Ashwood, she said, smiling for the first time since she'd walked in, a real smile, the kind that made the loneliness underneath it a little easier to see. Thank you. You have no idea what this means. He would, in time, understand exactly what it meant. But that afternoon, standing in a workshop that smelled of motor oil and old wood, all Elias knew was that something had shifted, quiet and irreversible as a stripped bolt finally coming free. He almost called it off twice before the week was out. The first time was that same night, lying awake in the farmhouse listening to the old pipes tick as they cooled, running through everything that could go wrong. He didn't know how to be anyone's husband, pretend or otherwise. He didn't know how to make small talk with a room full of parents who'd want to know things about a marriage that had never happened. He was good with machines because machines didn't ask questions. People did. He got as far as picking up the phone the next morning, the village directory open to the school's number, before he set it back down. He thought about the particular sound of Lyra's voice cracking on the word alone, and about the way she'd said it like a confession rather than a complaint, and he put the receiver back in its cradle without dialing. The second time was 3 days later, when Deacon Okafor, who ran the feed store and considered himself an authority on village gossip by virtue of standing behind a counter most people passed through eventually, mentioned, apropos of nothing, that he'd heard Ms. Ashwood had finally found herself a husband. Some mechanic, Deacon said, squinting at Elias like he was trying to place him. Word is he's kept it quiet. You wouldn't happen to know who that is, would you, Marrow? Small town like this, can't imagine there's more than one of you. Elias had gone very still over the crate of spark plugs he'd been sorting. Can't say I know anything about it, he said, which was, strictly speaking, still true, since nothing had happened yet. He drove out to the workshop that evening with his jaw tight, half convinced he should march over to the school and tell Lyra the whole thing was too much, too complicated, that he wasn't the right person for this. But when he pulled up, she was already there, sitting on the workshop's front step in the fading light, hugging her knees, looking like she'd been waiting for the courage to knock for longer than she wanted to admit. I heard people are already talking, she said before he'd even gotten out of the truck. I'm sorry. I didn't think it would spread this fast. If you want to back out, I understand completely. I can tell Principal Kessler I misspoke, that there's no husband, that I'll go alone and take whatever comes of it. Elias looked at her for a long moment, at the tired set of her shoulders, the practiced calm she was wearing over something rawer underneath, the way she'd already built an exit ramp for him before he'd said a single word. I'm not backing out, he said, surprising himself with how certain it sounded. I just wanted to make sure you were, before people start asking questions we haven't got answers to. Something in her face eased, relief so plain it made his chest ache a little. I'm sure, she said. Are you? He thought about the phone call he hadn't made, twice now, and understood that some part of him had already decided this before his mind had caught up to it. I'm sure, he said. They met twice before the festival, at Lyra's insistence, to get their story straight. As she put it, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table in his farmhouse with a legal pad and a pen like she was planning a lesson. We should keep it simple, she said. Married 8 months. We met when my car broke down on the mountain road. That part's even almost true, since I did once get a flat near your workshop. You fixed it, we got to talking, one thing led to another. 8 months, Elias repeated. That's specific. Long enough to be believable, short enough that people won't expect us to know each other's childhood stories. She tapped the pen against the pad. What's your favorite color? Why does that matter? Because someone's mother is absolutely going to ask me what your favorite color is, to test whether I actually know you, and I will not be caught flat-footed by Dolores Fenwick. Elias almost laughed. Green. Like the hills in October before the leaves turn all the way. Lyra wrote it down with the same care she probably gave to a child's spelling test. Mine's gold, she said without being asked, glancing up at him. Obviously. Obviously. He agreed, looking at her eyes, and then quickly looking back down at the table when he realized what he'd been looking at. They went through it all, his favorite meal, venison stew, his mother's recipe. Hers, anything with cinnamon, a habit from her own mother's kitchen, how they supposedly proposed, he insisted it happen at the workshop, because he refused to lie about somewhere romantic he'd never actually take anyone, what they tell the children who would inevitably ask if they had any babies on the way, a polite, practice not yet, we'll see. They worked out smaller things too, the kind of details that felt silly to rehearse but which Lyra insisted mattered. Which side of the bed he supposedly slept on, left, though there was of course no shared bed to speak of, whether he snored, a firm, laughing no, followed by Lyra's immediate correction that she had no idea and it was a terrible detail to have volunteered, what nickname she might use for him in front of people. Nothing, they agreed, first names were safer than inventing an intimacy either of them had earned yet. You're very thorough, Elias said, watching her fill a second page with notes. I'm a teacher, Lyra said. Thoroughness is the whole job. You plan for every question a child might ask because they will, without fail, ask the one you didn't plan for. What's the one you're most worried about? Lyra set the pen down and was quiet for a moment. Whether we're happy, she admitted. Kids can tell. They don't ask about mortgages or anniversaries. They ask if you're happy, and they know if you're lying about it. Elias considered this. Then I suppose we'd better actually enjoy ourselves, he said. So nobody has to lie about anything. By the second rehearsal, sitting on his porch as the sun went down gold and heavy over the mountains, something had softened between them. The nervousness in Lyra's shoulders had eased. She laughed more easily, a real laugh, not the careful one she used with parents at pick-up time. Elias found himself watching the way her ears moved when she talked, flicking up with interest, drooping slightly when she remembered something sad, standing at full alert when she was making a joke and waiting to see if it would land. "Can I ask you something?" he said, as the sky went the color of a bruise healing. "Why haven't you actually married anyone? You're—" He stopped himself, aware he was skating close to something. "I'm what?" Lyra asked, tail curling behind her on the porch step. "You're the most swell-like person in this whole village," he said instead of the word he'd almost used, which had been beautiful. "Every kid in the school thinks the sun rises because you tell it to. I don't understand why some line of suitors isn't out front of the school every day at 3 o'clock. Lyra was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening orchard. "I came here for the job," she said finally. "Not for the village. My family's orchard failed the year I turned 23. Bad blight, 3 seasons running, and we lost it. My mother passed not long after, from a heart that I think just gave out from grief more than anything a doctor could name. I didn't have anywhere else to put all the love I had left over, so I put it into teaching. Into other people's children." She picked at a loose thread on her cardigan. "And somewhere along the way I think I decided it was safer to be loved by 3 dozen 8-year-olds every September than to risk loving one person who might also leave." Elias didn't say anything right away. He understood that kind of math better than most, the sum a person does after loss, deciding what's safe to want and what isn't. "My parents died in a rockslide on the mountain pass when I was 19, he said. "My grandfather raised me the rest of the way, and then he went 2-3 years later. I kept the workshop because it was something to do with my hands that didn't require anyone else showing up. Same math, I think. Different orchard." Lyra looked at him then, really looked, in a way that made him feel unusually visible. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "For both of ours." "Me too," he said. "For both of ours." They sat in the quiet a while longer, 2 lonely people who had, for entirely practical reasons, agreed to pretend not to be lonely for one single day. Neither of them said aloud what was becoming obvious even that early, that the pretending had already started to feel like something else. The gymnasium was strung with paper lanterns and hand-painted banners that read welcome families in the careful, uneven lettering of children who'd clearly been allowed to help. Long tables sagged under the weight of 100 casseroles, each one someone's grandmother's specialty, and the whole room smelled like cinnamon and roast chicken and the particular dust of a gym floor that had been swept for the occasion but not mopped in months. Elias had worn the only collared shirt he owned that wasn't stained with engine grease. He tugged at the collar as they walked in, Lyra's arm looped through his. Her idea. For authenticity. Though the warmth of her hand through his sleeve was doing very little to calm the nervous hammer of his heart. "Just smile," she murmured. "And for the love of everything, don't tell anyone your favorite meal is venison stew unless they specifically ask. It'll sound rehearsed." "It is rehearsed." "Sure." The first hurdle was a boy named Tobias, small and gap-toothed, who barreled up to Lyra's knees before they'd made it 10 steps into the gym. "Miss Ashwood! Miss Ashwood, is this your husband?" "He is," Lyra said, and Elias felt the lie settle over him like a coat, itchy at first, then oddly warm. Tobias craned his neck up at Elias with the frank, assessing stare only a child can manage. "You fixed my dad's tractor last spring. That true?" Elias asked. "John Beckwith's place, Red Barn?" "Yeah. That's my dad." "Small world," Elias said, and meant it, and Tobias seemed satisfied enough by this to run off toward the cinnamon rolls, hollering the news to anyone in earshot. "Ms. Ashwood's husband fixed my dad's tractor." It went like that for an hour. Word seemed to spread through the gymnasium faster than either of them could keep pace with it. Ms. Ashwood's husband was here. Ms. Ashwood's husband was a mechanic, MS. Ashwood's husband fixed the Hendersons' bicycle and the Beckwith's tractor, and once, according to a rumor Elias couldn't trace the origin of, apparently saved Mrs. Purbeck's life during a blizzard, which was not remotely true but which he found himself too flustered to correct in the moment. Principal Kessler herself found them near the punch table, a tall, severe-looking woman whose reputation for sternness Lyra had warned him about extensively. She looked Elias over with the same evaluating gaze Dolores would later turn on him, though hers carried the particular weight of someone responsible for an entire school's worth of reputations. "So you're the mystery husband," Kessler said. "I confess I'd started to wonder if Ms. Ashwood had invented you entirely." "Wouldn't be the most interesting thing I've ever heard invented," Elias said, "but I promise I'm real. Ask my customers. Half the tractors in this county would agree." Something almost like a smile crossed Kessler's stern mouth. "Well, I'm glad you finally decided to join us, Mr. Merrill. Ms. Ashwood is the finest teacher this school has had in 20 years, and it does the students good to see that kind of steadiness reflected at home. Families notice these things, whether we mean them to or not." The words settled oddly in Elias's chest after Kessler moved on. A small, unearned pride at being called steady, at the idea that he was somehow reflecting well on a woman he'd known for less than 2 weeks. At the craft table, a cluster of Lyra's students had set up butcher paper and a box of crayons, working on family portraits for a bulletin board display. A small girl with pigtails and an enormous grin tugged on Elias's sleeve and thrust a drawing at him. 2 figures, one with orange fur and fox ears, one with plain brown hair, holding hands beneath the sun with a smiling face, a little fox pup drawn between them. "That's you and Ms. Ashwood," the girl announced, as though this were self-evident. "And that's your baby fox." "We don't have a baby fox," Elias said gently. "Not yet," the girl said, with the serene confidence of someone who had clearly already decided how this story ended, and skipped off before he could argue further. He found Lyra a moment later, laughing at something Dolores Fenwick had said, one hand resting lightly on his forearm when he reappeared at her side, as natural as though they'd done this 1,000 times. Dolores, sharp-eyed, silver-muzzled, the unofficial matriarch of village gossip, turned her attention to Elias with the focus of a woman conducting an inspection. "So you're the one who finally caught our Lyra," she said. 8 months married and not a whisper of it around town until now." "That's a neat trick. We kept it quiet," Elias said, which was, he reflected, the truest thing he'd said all evening. "Didn't want to fuss." "Well..." Dolores's eyes narrowed, not unkindly, more like a woman deciding whether to believe a story she'd badly wanted to be true. "What's her favorite color, then, if you're really her husband?" "Gold," Elias said without hesitation. "Like her eyes." Something in Dolores's expression cracked open into genuine delight, and beside him, Lyra went very still, her ears flattening slightly in a way Elias couldn't quite read, surprise, maybe, or something warmer. "Well, isn't that sweet?" Dolores said, already turning to find the next person to tell. Near the dessert table, an elderly neighbor named Cordelia Wren, easily the oldest resident in the village and famous for saying whatever crossed her mind without apparent filter, caught Elias by the sleeve as he passed. "You too," she said, peering up at him with milky, knowing eyes. "I've seen you both walking past each other for years, you know. Her toward the school, you toward the workshop, every morning like 2 rivers that never quite touched banks. I always thought it was a waste." She patted his arm with surprising strength. "Glad someone finally had the sense to fix that." "We didn't exactly plan it," Elias said carefully. "Nobody ever does," Cordelia said, and there was something almost prophetic in the way she said it, though Elias wouldn't understand quite how prophetic until much later. Later, near the end of the evening, as the crowd began to thin and the paper lanterns swayed in the draft of the propped open doors, Elias and Lyra found a quiet corner near the punch bowl. Her arm was still through his, habit now, more than performance. You didn't have to say that, she said quietly. About the color. It's true, Elias said, and then, hearing himself, felt his ears go hot in a way that had nothing to do with fox biology, and everything to do with the fact that he had just, without meaning to, told her something real in the middle of a lie. I mean, it suits you. The gold. Lyra looked up at him, golden eyes catching the lantern light, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The gymnasium noise faded to a low hum around them. Children laughing, someone's radio playing an old waltz through a crackling speaker, the general warm chaos of a village celebrating itself. Thank you, she said finally. For today. I know it was a lot to ask. It wasn't as bad as I thought, Elias admitted. Some of it was, actually good. Some of it, Lyra agreed softly, and neither of them clarified which parts they meant, though both of them, if pressed, could have named every single one. Elias woke the next day expecting the strange, borrowed warmth of the festival to have faded overnight, the way a good dream loses its color in daylight. Instead, he found himself standing in his kitchen making 2 cups of coffee out of habit before he remembered there was no one else there to drink the second one, and feeling an unexpected pang of loneliness at the sight of the extra mug. He was still staring at it, faintly embarrassed at himself, when a knock came at the door. Lyra stood on the step, still in her weekend clothes, a canvas bag over one shoulder. I know the deal was one day, she said, a little breathless, as though she'd walked faster than she meant to. But I told you I'd start on the orchard, and I don't break promises. Even the ones attached to fake marriages. Elias looked past her toward the tangled mess of trees behind the house, then back at her, and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized had been tight. I made too much coffee, he said. Come in before it gets cold. She stepped inside, and it was, though either of them named it that morning, the true beginning of everything that followed, not the workshop, not the festival, but this, an ordinary Sunday, 2 coffee mugs instead of one, and a woman who kept her promises even when she had every excuse not to. True to her word, Lyra showed up the following Saturday morning in old canvas trousers and work gloves, her hair, or rather the fur along her crown, longer than the rest, which she wore pulled back in a practical braid, tied up with a faded ribbon. She stood at the edge of the overgrown orchard behind Elias's farmhouse with her hands on her hips, surveying the tangle of wild branches and waist-high grass like a general assessing a battlefield. It's worse than I thought, she said, sounding delighted rather than deterred. But it's not dead. Look. She pushed through the grass to a gnarled old apple tree and ran her fingers along its bark with a tenderness that made Elias's chest tighten unexpectedly. This one's a northern spy. Must be 60 years old. It just needs someone to care about it again. They worked through the morning, clearing brush, pruning dead limbs, Lyra calling out instructions with the patient authority of someone who'd spent a childhood doing exactly this. Elias, more comfortable with engines than orchards, found himself an eager, if clumsy, student. Not there, Lyra said, catching his wrist as he raised the pruning shears toward a branch. Her hand was warm and calloused against his skin, and neither of them moved for a beat longer than the correction required. You cut above the bud, angled away, or the water pools and rots the wound. Like this. She guided his hand, her fingers over his, showing him the angle. There. See? I see, Elias said, though he wasn't entirely sure he was looking at the branch anymore. They broke for lunch around noon, sitting on overturned crates in a rare patch of cleared ground, sharing sandwiches Lyra had packed without asking whether he'd want any, an assumption that would have irritated him from anyone else and which he found, from her, oddly comforting. Tell me about your grandfather, she said, watching him look out at the orchard rows with an expression she was beginning to learn to read. The one who planted all this. Ferris Marrow, Elias said. Stubborn as a mule, twice as loud, and about the only person who ever made me feel like I wasn't a burden after my parents died. He turned a bit of bread crust over in his fingers. He used to say a good orchard was just patience with roots. Plant something, wait, don't give up on it even when it looks dead through the winter. I think he meant it about more than trees, but I didn't understand that until a lot later. He sounds wonderful. He would have liked you, Elias said, surprising himself with the certainty of it. He liked people who worked with their hands and didn't complain about it. Lyra smiled, ears tilting toward him in that way he was beginning to recognize as pleasure. Then I suppose I'd better not complain about the blisters I'm definitely going to have tomorrow. They fell into an easy rhythm over the following weeks. Saturdays in the orchard, evenings that started as Lyra grading papers at his kitchen table while he cleaned tools at the counter and somehow, without either of them planning it, turned into shared dinners, her cinnamon spice stew recipe traded for his mother's venison one, conversations that ran long past the dishes being done. One Saturday in late September, a sudden rainstorm caught them both out among the trees, and they ended up sprinting for the farmhouse porch, soaked through, laughing in a way that had nothing performed about it. Lyra's fur was plastered flat against her, her braid coming loose, and Elias found himself staring for a beat too long before catching himself. "What?" she asked, wringing out the hem of her shirt. "Nothing," he said. You laugh like you mean it." Not like the careful laugh you use for parents. Lyra went quiet for a moment, studying him. "You notice there's a difference?" "I notice a lot of things about you," Elias admitted, and then, embarrassed by his own honesty, busied himself fetching towels from inside, leaving Lyra on the porch with her heart doing something complicated that she wasn't ready to name yet either. One evening in early autumn, a knock came at Elias's door well past dark. He opened it to find one of Lyra's students, a serious-faced boy named Marcus, holding a shoebox with holes punched in the lid and tears streaking his face. "Ms. Ashwood said you'd know what to do," Marcus said, voice shaking. "I found him in the woods behind the school. His mama's gone. I don't know where. He won't stop shivering." Inside the box, curled into the smallest possible shape, was a fox pup. No more than a few weeks old, matted and thin, one ear torn, shivering exactly as reported. Elias looked at the boy's tear-streaked face and didn't have the heart to say he had no idea what to do with an orphan pup. He called Lyra. She arrived within 15 minutes, still in her school clothes, breathless from hurrying. "Oh," she said softly, kneeling beside the box, her whole demeanor shifting into something fierce and gentle at once. "Oh, you poor thing." She lifted the pup with practiced care, tucking him against her chest, murmuring low words in a language Elias didn't recognize. Old Vulpine, maybe, something from further back than the village's memory. They spent that night in Elias's kitchen, feeding the pup warm formula through an eyedropper Lyra produced from some emergency kit she kept for exactly this kind of crisis, taking turns holding him against their chests to keep him warm. Marcus fell asleep in a kitchen chair around midnight, and Elias carried him home to his worried parents, promising updates. By 3 a.m, the pup had finally stopped shivering, curled in the crook of Lyra's arm as she sat on Elias's porch step, exhausted and glowing with the particular tenderness of someone who has just saved a small life. "We should give him a name," she said quietly, not looking up from the pup. "We?" Elias asked, sitting down beside her. "Well, he can't stay with me, my apartment doesn't allow it. And Marcus's parents already have 2 dogs who'd make his life miserable." She glanced up at Elias, golden eyes soft in the porch light. "You have all this land. All this quiet. It would just be until he's old enough to." "You're asking me to keep a fox," Elias said. "I'm asking my husband to keep a fox," Lyra said, and there was a teasing lightness in her voice that didn't quite hide the hope underneath it. Elias looked down at the pup, tiny and trusting, asleep now in the crook of Lyra's arm, and then at Lyra herself, hair loose from its ribbon, exhaustion and tenderness written plain across her face in the porch light, and understood with sudden, quiet clarity that he would have agreed to almost anything she asked of him in that moment. "What should we call him?" he asked instead of any of the things he was actually thinking. Lyra considered, tilting her head. "Ash," she said finally. For new beginnings. Things that grow back after the fire. Ash, Elias agreed, reaching out to touch the pup's torn ear with one gentle finger. Welcome home. Neither of them commented on the word home, or the way it had slipped out so easily, as though the farmhouse had already, without official announcement, become something shared. Autumn deepened into the kind of golden, slow-turning weeks that made the mountain town feel like it existed outside of time. The orchard, under Lyra's patient hands, began to show real signs of life. New growth along old branches, the wild grass tamed into rose, a scarecrow that Ash the fox pup treated as a mortal enemy and attacked with great seriousness at least twice a week. The village, for its part, had fully absorbed the fiction of the Merrow marriage into its own mythology. Dolores Fenwick told anyone who'd listen that she'd always known those two would end up together, conveniently forgetting that she'd never mentioned either of them in the same sentence before the festival. Old Mrs. Purbeck began leaving 2 portions of stew on her porch instead of 1, insisting Elias take the second home to his wife. The children in Lyra's class drew an entire wall's worth of family portraits featuring Ms. Ashwood, Mr. Merrow, and their fox, which hung in the school hallway with a permanence that made both of them, on separate occasions, stop and stare at it a beat too long. It should have felt like a lie sustained. Instead, it felt, increasingly, like a life they had simply started living. There were harder moments too, ones that tested the fiction in ways either of them had planned for. In late October, Lyra's second cousin, a brusque, well-meaning woman named Petra who lived 2 towns over and hadn't gotten the memo about keeping the marriage vague, showed up unannounced at the school asking to meet the husband nobody in the family had heard about. Lyra handled it with the smooth improvisation of someone who'd been quietly terrified of exactly this scenario, inventing a small family rift as the reason for the secrecy, an explanation flimsy enough that it left her hands shaking once Petra had gone. "I hate lying to family," she admitted to Elias that evening, sitting at his kitchen table with her head in her hands. "I hate that it's getting bigger instead of smaller. I thought it would just be the festival, and then it would fade, and instead every week it just becomes more real to more people. Do you want to end it?" Elias asked, and he was surprised by how much he didn't want her to say yes. Lyra looked up at him, something unreadable in her expression. "No," she said slowly, like she was discovering the answer as she spoke it. "That's the strange part. I don't. I should feel trapped by all this, and instead I just feel—" She stopped herself, shook her head. "Never mind. I don't know how to finish that sentence yet. Take your time," Elias said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." It was an ordinary thing to say, the kind of reassurance offered 100 times a day in 100 kitchens across the world. But it landed on Lyra like something much larger, and she held onto it, quietly, for weeks afterward. "I keep waiting for it to feel strange," Lyra admitted one evening, sitting on the porch with Ash curled at her feet, watching the sun bleed orange and pink over the orchard rows. "Everyone treating us like we're really married. And it just doesn't. It feels like the most natural thing in the world." Elias, sitting beside her with 2 mugs of cider he'd pressed himself from the orchard's own apples, was quiet for a moment. "Maybe that's not strange," he said carefully. "Maybe that's just what it is." Lyra looked at him, and something passed between them, unspoken and fragile as the last light on the mountains. "Elias," she started. "Lyra." He said her name back like an answer to a question she hadn't finished asking. Before either of them could find the courage to say more, Ash let out an enormous, undignified sneeze and knocked over Elias's mug of cider, and the moment dissolved into laughter and clean-up, the confession, whatever it might have been, set aside for another evening. But it didn't disappear. It only waited, the way things do when they're true and simply haven't found their moment yet. The first hard frost arrived in November, silvering the orchard grass and sending Ash into an ecstatic, uncoordinated frenzy the first time he encountered ice on the water trough. Elias spent a cold Saturday helping Lyra wrap the young grafts she'd started in burlap to protect them through the winter, both of them breathing clouds into the sharp morning air. They won't all make it, Lyra said, tying off a length of burlap around a slender new graft with careful hands. That's just how orchards work. You plant 20, you might lose 5, and you don't always know which 5 until spring tells you. Does that bother you? Elias asked. Not knowing? It used to, she admitted. When my family's orchard failed, I think what broke me wasn't just losing the trees. It was the not knowing beforehand, going to sleep every night wondering if this was the season the blight finally won. I think that's part of why I never let myself want things too openly after. Not knowing felt too much like waiting to lose something all over again. Elias considered this, watching his breath fog in the cold air. And now? Lyra looked at him for a long moment, her expression softer than the question probably warranted. Now I'm starting to think not knowing is just what it costs to have something worth losing, she said. I'd rather risk it than go back to having nothing to lose at all. They didn't say more than that, but something settled between them in the frost-silvered quiet, a kind of understanding neither of them was ready to speak aloud yet. The village's winter market, held the first Saturday of December in the town square under strings of lantern light, became another quiet marker of how far they'd come. They walked it together, Ash trotting at their heels on his increasingly resented leash, stopping at stalls selling roasted chestnuts and mulled cider and Mrs. Purbeck's famous spice bread. More than one villager commented on how well the two of them seemed to fit, an observation that would have mortified Elias 2 months prior, and which now simply made him reach, without thinking about it, for Lyra's gloved hand. She didn't pull away. If anything, her fingers curled around his, and neither of them mentioned it, though both of them noticed, and both of them, walking home that night under a sky scattered with early winter stars, found themselves smiling for reasons they weren't yet willing to name out loud. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, official and cream-colored, bearing the crest of the Aurelian Academy. The most prestigious school in the capital, a place Lyra had once dreamed about with the particular ache of a young teacher who knew she'd probably never see the inside of it. She read it standing in her own small kitchen, then read it again, then sat down heavily at the table because her legs seemed to have stopped fully cooperating. Dear Ms. Ashwood, the Board of Governors is pleased to offer you the position of headmistress, effective the start of the spring term. Your reputation for exceptional pedagogy and community leadership has reached us through several channels, and we believe your vision aligns closely with the Academy's mission. It went on. Salary figures that made her blink twice. A description of resources, a real library, a real science laboratory, funding for the kind of programs she'd only ever dreamed of running in a rural school with a leaking roof and a budget stretched thinner every year. It was, in every practical sense, the opportunity of a lifetime. The job she had wanted since she was 22 years old, standing in the ruins of her family's failed orchard, deciding what to do with the rest of her life. She should have felt nothing but joy. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table for a long time, staring out the window toward the mountain road that led, eventually, to a workshop that smelled of motor oil, and an orchard coming back to life one careful cut at a time, and a fox pup who slept curled against a man's chest most nights because Ash refused any other arrangement, and a house that had somehow, over 4 months, stopped being his house and started being something closer to theirs, even though nothing about their arrangement had ever officially changed. She didn't tell Elias that night. Or the next. He noticed anyway. He'd learned, over the months, to read the particular tilt of her ears when something weighed on her, the way her tail went still instead of its usual restless curl. He didn't push. He simply kept showing up. Dinner on the table, cider pressed fresh, Ash fed and walked and generally spoiled beyond all reasonable limits, and waited for her to find her way to whatever it was she needed to say. In the meantime, the not saying pressed on both of them in small, telling ways. Lyra found herself lingering longer than usual at the school each evening, unable to face the drive back to the farmhouse and the conversation she was avoiding. Elias found himself unusually short with a long-time customer, snapping at a perfectly reasonable question about a carburetor because his mind was somewhere else entirely, turning over the change in Lyra he couldn't yet name. He finally asked her directly on a Thursday, the two of them shelling late-season walnuts at the kitchen table while Ash dozed by the stove. "Something's been sitting on you for a week," Elias said, not looking up from the walnut in his hands. "You don't have to tell me what it is. But I'd rather you tell me it's there than watch you carry it alone at my own kitchen table." Lyra set down her nutcracker. "I'm sorry," she said. "I've just been trying to figure out how to say it without it changing everything before I've even decided anything." "Say it anyway," Elias said gently. "I'd rather know." She found it on that Sunday evening in late October. No, it was November now, though she'd lost track of exactly how many days she'd been sitting on the letter. The orchard behind them nearly finished, rows of pruned and cared-for trees stretching back toward the tree line, promising a real harvest come next fall. "I have to tell you something," she said, and something in her voice made Ash lift his head from where he'd been dozing between them and look up with the particular alertness animals have for approaching sadness. Elias set down the mug he'd been holding. "Okay. I've been offered the headmistress position at the Aurelian Academy. In the capital." She said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. It's everything I ever wanted, professionally. A real school. Real resources. The kind of impact I've dreamed about since before I ever set foot in this village." Elias was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful, controlled in a way that told her he was working hard to keep it that way. "That's incredible, Lyra. You deserve that. More than anyone I've ever known." "It would mean leaving," she said. "The village. The school here. The orchard." A pause, her golden eyes finding his in the porch light, the same light under which they'd first named a fox pup and, though either of them had said it aloud, first started falling. "You." There it was. The word neither of them had used out loud in 4 months of pretending to be something they'd somehow, quietly, actually become. "When would you have to decide?" Elias asked, and his voice had gone very rough. 2 weeks. They sat in silence, the autumn evening cooling around them, Ash's head resting on Lyra's knee as though he understood, in the way animals sometimes do, that something important and painful was happening above him. "I don't want to be the reason you don't take it," Elias said finally, staring out at the orchard she'd brought back from the dead with her own 2 hands. "You spent your whole life pouring love into other people's kids because you thought you couldn't risk loving something that might leave you. I'm not going to be the person who tells you to shrink your whole life down to fit inside this village because I'm scared of an empty porch. And I don't want to be the reason you stay lonely in a farmhouse with an orchard and no one to share the harvest with," Lyra said, her voice thick. "That's not fair either." "Then what do we do?" Elias asked, and it was the first time in 4 months of careful, practiced pretending that either of them had asked a question with no rehearsed answer waiting behind it. Lyra didn't have one either. Not that night. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of Elias's life. Lyra kept teaching, kept grading papers at his kitchen table some evenings out of a habit that had become too dear to both of them to break just because a decision loomed, kept showing up to walk the orchard rows with Ash trotting at her heels, his torn ear now fully healed, his coat glossy with good food and better care. But there was a new quality to the quiet between them. Not the easy quiet they built over the autumn, but a hell-breath kind of silence, the sound of 2 people each trying not to be the one who tips a scale they were both afraid to touch. Elias thought about it constantly while he worked, under the hood of some farmer's aging truck, hands moving on autopilot, while his mind turned the same question over and over. He thought about the sentence "when did pretending stop being pretend," though he never said it aloud, because he was afraid that naming it might make it too real to survive an answer he didn't want to hear. He drove to the capital once during that stretch, alone, on the pretense of sourcing a hard-to-find part for a customer's antique tractor. He walked past the Aurelian Academy's tall iron gates without going in, just to see the place that might take her from him. Grand stone buildings, manicured lawns, students in crisp uniforms crossing a courtyard with the particular busy confidence of a school that never had to worry about a leaking roof. He understood, standing there, exactly why it would call to her. He also understood, with a clarity that ached, that no matter how much he wanted her to stay, he had no right to ask her to choose the smaller life over the larger one just because it happened to include him. He drove home without telling her he'd gone. Lyra, for her part, spent a long evening on the phone with her old university mentor, a retired professor named Ilse Coven who had taught her everything she knew about pedagogy and precisely nothing about matters of the heart, though she offered opinions on both freely. "You're describing a man who taught himself to love a fox pup at 3 in the morning because you asked him to," Ilse said, not unkindly, over the crackling long-distance line. "That's not nothing, Lyra. That's not a small thing to walk away from for a bigger office and a better library. It's not just about him," Lyra said. "It's about the whole life. The orchard. The village. 6 years I spent making this place home, and it finally feels like it actually is one." "Then you already know the answer," Ilse said gently. "You're just afraid of how much it's going to hurt to say it out loud." Lyra thought about his grandfather, who'd built this farmhouse with his own hands for a wife he'd loved for 40 years, who used to say that the mountain town wasn't much, but it was enough, if you had someone worth staying for. She thought about the sum she'd done after her mother died, after the orchard failed, the safe, small math of a life built around other people's children because they, unlike a husband, could never really leave her the way grief had taught her to expect. She thought about Elias's hand over hers, showing her nothing for once, showing her instead how to let herself be shown something, how to trust someone else's steadiness when her own had run thin. 9 days after the letter, Elias found himself standing in front of Lyra's small apartment above the bakery, a paper bag of the last of the season's apples in one hand, Ash trotting beside him on a leash the fox pup still resented on principle. He hadn't planned what to say. He'd simply found himself walking there after closing the workshop, the way water finds the lowest point without needing a map. Lyra opened the door before he even knocked, as though she'd been standing on the other side of it for longer than made sense. "I was going to call you," she said. "I was going to knock," he said. "Same idea, I guess." They stood there for a moment, an apple pup between them literally and figuratively, and then Lyra laughed, a small, wet, surprised laugh, and said, "This is ridiculous. We pretended to be married for a school festival and now I can't figure out how to tell you I don't want to move to the capital without you, and it feels somehow harder than the lie ever was." "Then don't tell me that," Elias said, his heart hammering so loud he was fairly sure she could hear it. "Tell me something true instead." Lyra's eyes were bright, gold catching the last of the daylight over his shoulder. "I love you," she said simply, like a fact she'd been carrying so long it had stopped feeling like news and started feeling like weather. "I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the festival. Maybe it was the orchard. Maybe it was the 3rd night in a row you stayed up with me feeding Ash from an eyedropper even though you had a full day of work in the morning. I don't know when the pretending stopped. I just know it did, a long time before either of us said so out loud." "I know exactly when it stopped for me," Elias said. "It was the moment you told Dolores Fenwick my favorite color, and I realized you'd actually been listening. Not performing. Listening. Nobody's really listened to me like that since my grandfather died." He set the bag of apples down on the step, freeing both hands, and reached for hers. "I don't want you to give up the academy for me. I mean that. But I also don't want you to walk away from this, from us. Because you think loving me means shrinking your life. I'll follow you to the capital if that's what it takes. I've got 2 hands and I can fix an engine anywhere in the world. But I'd rather you stayed because you wanted to, not because you were choosing between 2 things you love and picking the smaller one out of guilt." Lyra was crying now, quietly, the particular kind of crying that comes when a person has been holding something in for so long that its release feels almost like relief. "I called the academy this morning," she said. "Before you got here. I asked if there was any way to advise remotely, or consult part-time, or anything that would let me keep a foot in both worlds. They said no. It's headmistress in the capital, full-time, or nothing." Elias's chest tightened. And I told them I needed until tomorrow, Lyra said. Because I realized I couldn't answer the question honestly until I'd asked you the real one. Not the practical one about moving. The real one. She looked up at him, gold eyes steady despite the tears. Elias Marrow. When did pretending stop being pretend for you? He thought about all the ways he could answer. The festival, the orchard, the fox pup, the porch, the 100 small true things that had accumulated quietly into one large true thing. In the end he chose the simplest one. The moment you walked into my workshop and asked me to be your husband for a day, he said. I think some part of me said yes to a lot more than a day. I just didn't have the courage to admit it until right now. Lyra let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob, and closed the distance between them, and Elias kissed her, really kissed her, for the first time, no audience of children or gossiping neighbors to perform for, nothing pretend about it at all. On the small landing above the bakery, with a fox pup tangled around both their ankles and the last of the autumn light going gold over the mountain town that had, without either of them fully realizing it, become home. She didn't take the Aurelian position. Not because Elias asked her to stay, and not out of guilt, but because when she finally sat with the true question instead of the practical one, the answer had been obvious all along. She had already found the place she wanted to pour the rest of her love into, and it wasn't a prestigious building full of strangers in the capital. It was a village school with a crooked flagpole. It was an orchard coming back to life one careful cut at a time. It was a mechanic with grease-stained hands and a heart that had been waiting, patient as an old apple tree, for someone willing to prune away the dead wood and let something new grow. She wrote to the Academy's board with genuine gratitude and a respectful decline, and 2 months later, when the village school's ancient roof finally gave out in a hard winter storm, she used her sudden minor local fame, Ms. Ashwood, the teacher who'd turned down the capital for her students, to rally a fundraising campaign that fixed not just the roof but the leaking windows and the science room that had been unusable for a decade. The Academy's loss became the village's unlikely windfall, and nobody in town needed telling twice why she'd stayed. Principal Kessler, upon hearing the news, allowed herself the rare luxury of a full smile. I always thought there was more holding you here than you let on, she told Lyra. I'm glad you finally let it show. Winter passed the way winters do in a mountain town. Slow, silver, and quiet, broken up by the small warm rituals of two people building a life together in plain sight of a village that had decided, months before either of them caught up, that they belonged to each other. Elias built Ash a proper den beside the wood stove, which the fox used exactly once before deciding the foot of Elias and Lyra's shared bed was infinitely superior. Lyra spent the cold months poring over grafting catalogs, planning the orchard's spring editions with the meticulous joy of someone finally allowed to want something out loud. They told Marcus first, of all people, that the marriage which had started as fiction was about to become fact. It seemed only right, since his shivering fox-pup discovery had done more to bind them together than either festival or orchard combined. The boy received the news with the grave seriousness of someone confirming a theory he'd held for months. I knew it wasn't pretend, he said solemnly. Ash knew too. Foxes always know. The wedding, a real one this time, small and unhurried, held beneath the very orchard trees Lyra had brought back from ruin, took place the following spring, when the northern spy apple tree put out its first real blossoms in over a decade. Dolores Fenwick cried through the entire ceremony and told everyone within earshot that she had, of course, always known. Cordelia Wren, seated in the front row on a folding chair someone had padded specially for her old bones, nodded along like a woman watching a prophecy fulfill itself exactly on schedule. Marcus, older now by a full grade and inordinately proud of himself, served as Ash's official handler, since the fox, fully grown, sleek, and still deeply suspicious of scarecrows, insisted on attending and required, in his opinion, a dedicated escort down the aisle. Elias stood beneath the blossoming branches in the same collared shirt he'd worn to the festival a year before, and watched Lyra walk toward him through rows of trees she'd saved with her own 2 hands, gold eyes bright with a happiness that had nothing left to pretend about, and thought about his grandfather's old saying. That the mountain town wasn't much, but it was enough, if you had someone worth staying for. He'd found her, he realized, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, elbow deep in a stripped bolt, expecting nothing more than another quiet, uneventful day. Some things, it turned out, only needed one small yes to start growing back: an orchard, a village's trust, a heart that had spent years convincing itself it was safer left fallow. By the time the apples came in that autumn, the first real harvest the orchard had produced in 20 years, the whole village turned out to help pick, children weaving between the rows with baskets nearly as big as they were, Ash chasing fallen apples with the same undignified enthusiasm he brought to everything, and Elias and Lyra standing together at the orchard's edge, watching the harvest of a life neither of them had planned but both of them, in the end, had chosen with their whole hearts. What began as a single day of pretending had become, quietly and without either of them quite noticing the exact moment it happened, the truest thing either of them had ever known.